The impossible has just become reality. In a ruling that has left Britain stunned, the Supreme Court has forced Prime Minister Keir Starmer out of office. What began as whispers of scandal has exploded into the greatest constitutional crisis of modern times. A man once hailed as the defender of justice is now condemned by the highest guardians of law. His reputation torn to pieces in front of the nation and the world. The gavel has fallen, the verdict is in, and Britain has been plunged into chaos. The judgment struck like a thunderbolt across Westminster. Within moments of the ruling, Britain was hurled into turmoil. The Supreme Court, in a decision stretching hundreds of pages, laid bare a devastating catalogue of misconduct that shattered any last illusion of Starmer's integrity. The Chief Justice delivered the words with steel in her voice, declaring that this was not simply a matter of politics, but a fight for the very survival of democracy. The accusations were relentless and merciless. Secret donations hidden in offshore accounts, luxury trips disguised as official duties, undisclosed gifts from shadowy donors, and a scandal surrounding properties that revealed deliberate deception. Every detail painted not the image of a careless leader, but of a man who had betrayed the very principles he had once sworn to protect. Westminster erupted in panic. Ministers rushed into emergency meetings, aides darted through corridors carrying urgent notes, and journalists scrambled to flood the airwaves with breaking headlines. Across Britain, television screens glowed with alerts, radios crackled with frantic voices, and social media platforms ignited with hashtags screaming "Starmer out," "Justice served," and "Britain in crisis." The fury of the people spilled into the streets within minutes. Outside Parliament, thousands gathered, their chants echoing like thunder against the walls of power. Resign now. Resign now. What had once been whispered in the shadows was now shouted by millions across the country. The silence from Number 10 was deafening. No statement, no explanation, no attempt to defend. Inside, advisers argued over whether to force a resignation or gamble on clinging to power. But every passing moment of silence only deepened the public's anger and eroded what little loyalty remained in Starmer's party. Even Labour's most loyal supporters were breaking ranks, admitting privately that the party could no longer survive with a leader branded corrupt by the highest court in the land. The opposition pounced immediately. In the House of Commons, Rishi Sunak thundered that this was not just the fall of a man, but the collapse of governance itself. Nigel Farage went further, branding Starmer as morally bankrupt and demanding an immediate general election. Their voices reverberated across the chamber, while Labour MPs sat in stunned silence, powerless to defend the leader, who had been legally and publicly humiliated. Beyond Westminster, the fury spread like wildfire. In London, Manchester, Birmingham, Cardiff and Glasgow, protests erupted. Crowds surging through the streets with placards condemning corruption and betrayal. Social media carried their voices across the world, with videos of massive demonstrations going viral within minutes. Memes mocked the silence of Number 10, portraying Starmer as a coward, hiding from the people he once promised to serve. For millions, this scandal was no longer about one man. It was about decades of disillusionment, lies and betrayals from a political system that had lost the trust of its citizens. This ruling became the final spark, igniting years of frustration into unstoppable rage. The international reaction was swift and merciless. Headlines from New York to Paris to Brussels declared Britain in crisis. Markets reeled, the pound dropping as investors fled uncertainty. European leaders paused ongoing negotiations, refusing to engage until stability returned. The White House urged the UK to uphold the rule of law, while allies warned of a collapsing credibility that could leave Britain isolated on the world stage. Meanwhile, inside Downing Street, sources described a Prime Minister pacing in silence, consumed by bitterness, his authority stripped, his legacy obliterated. Every moment of silence was not seen as strength, but as cowardice, turning him into the symbol of a leader broken and paralysed. For the Labour Party, the damage was catastrophic. Cabinet ministers drafted resignation letters, party elders whispered of replacing him, and backbench MPs quietly prepared no-confidence motions. What had once been a united front had fractured into open rebellion. The knives were out and they were aimed not only at Starmer, but at the very foundations of Labour itself. Across Britain, one truth rang louder than all others. The era of Keir Starmer was over. The only question left was not if he would fall, but how soon and how hard. As the ruling tore through Westminster like a storm, the political machine that had once carried Starmer to power began to crumble from within. What started as whispers of unease among his closest allies soon erupted into open defiance. Ministers who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him only yesterday were now plotting his removal, meeting in secret rooms and drafting carefully worded resignation letters. Loyalty evaporated in the blink of an eye, replaced by fear. Fear that their own reputations, their own futures would be destroyed if they remained tied to a leader condemned by the Supreme Court. Shadow cabinet members, once his fiercest defenders, were said to be preparing mass walkouts. Leaked text messages spread like wildfire, exposing panic at the highest levels of Labour. "We cannot defend him," one message read. "If he stays, he takes us all down with him." The fear was contagious, rippling through the benches of Parliament, infecting every corner of the party. Backbench MPs whispered of submitting letters of no confidence, elders warned of total collapse, and long-time supporters admitted privately that the brand of Labour itself was now poisoned. Inside Number 10, the walls echoed with bitter arguments. Some advisers begged him to resign immediately, hoping to preserve at least a shred of dignity for the party. Others urged him to fight, to gamble on clinging to power in defiance of the court's ruling. But each passing moment of indecision was deadly. Every hour of silence deepened the anger of the public and widened the cracks in his party. Outside, the fury of the people was impossible to ignore. Protesters swarmed through London, their chants shaking the air like an earthquake. Placards branded with words like traitor and resign filled the skies above Parliament Square. In Manchester, furious crowds carried effigies of the Prime Minister chanting, "Guilty, guilty," while in Glasgow, citizens staged mock trials, reading aloud the Supreme Court's judgment and declaring Starmer unfit for office. What had begun as protest was becoming revolution, an unstoppable wave of outrage that no politician could control. Social media magnified the fury 1,000-fold. Hashtags demanding his resignation dominated global trends. Viral videos of mass demonstrations spread across the world in minutes. Memes mocked Starmer's silence, portraying him as a coward barricaded inside Downing Street while his nation crumbled outside. For millions of ordinary Britons, this was no longer about one man. It was about a system that had betrayed them again and again. The ruling became a rallying cry, turning quiet disillusionment into roaring fury. Meanwhile, the opposition exploited the chaos with ruthless precision. Conservatives declared that Labour was not merely corrupt, but rotten to its very core. Rishi Sunak thundered in Parliament that this is not just the fall of a Prime Minister, it is the collapse of a government built on lies. His words struck Labour like hammer blows, each one driving home the image of a party in total ruin. Nigel Farage, with triumph in his voice, declared that only Reform UK could restore honesty to British politics. He branded Starmer morally bankrupt, casting himself as the champion of the betrayed and urging voters to rise against the corrupt establishment. Even the Liberal Democrats, often ignored in the great battles of power, seized the moment, demanding Starmer's resignation and positioning themselves as an alternative to chaos. The combined voices of opposition formed a chorus of condemnation louder than anything Britain had heard in decades. And the press? They smelled blood. Newspapers across the spectrum ripped into Starmer with headlines screaming betrayal, cowardice, collapse. The Daily Mail thundered with the words corruption at Number 10. The Guardian, usually a shield for Labour, turned its editorial sword against him, declaring bluntly, "The people deserve better." The tabloids plastered his face across front pages with captions of disgrace, while television broadcasters tore apart every detail of the judgment in merciless detail. BBC anchors called it a constitutional earthquake, while Sky News labelled it the endgame for Starmer. Talk show hosts wasted no time in branding him a coward, with Piers Morgan bluntly declaring, "This is the most damning indictment of a Prime Minister in British history." Every screen, every headline, every voice hammered the same truth. Keir Starmer's time was over. Yet still, Number 10 remained silent. Starmer refused to resign, refused to speak, refused even to appear. That silence, once a shield, became a sword against him. It was no longer seen as dignity. It was cowardice, weakness, betrayal. His silence deepened the nation's fury, transforming him from embattled leader to symbol of a broken, corrupt system. Inside Parliament, knives were being sharpened. In the streets, fury was boiling into rage, and across the world, allies and rivals alike watched Britain unravel. The question was no longer if Starmer would fall, but how devastating the collapse would be and whether Labour could survive the wreckage. The storm was no longer confined to Westminster. It was spreading across Britain with unstoppable force, seizing every city, every street, every household. From London to Liverpool, from Cardiff to Belfast, the fury was palpable. Crowds surged through the streets with placards raised high, their chants of "Resign, resign" echoing like a battle cry across the nation. Outside Number 10, the air vibrated with rage as thousands gathered, demanding that the Prime Minister face them. Police lined the barricades, their shields raised, their faces tense, knowing that the order could collapse at any moment. In Manchester, protesters carried cardboard coffins marked with the words integrity and democracy, symbolising what they believed Starmer had buried under layers of lies. In Glasgow, citizens staged mock tribunals in city squares, reading aloud the charges laid out by the Supreme Court before symbolically tearing down images of their disgraced leader. These were not isolated gatherings. They were an uprising, fueled by years of betrayal and ignited by the most damning ruling in modern British history. Social media magnified the fire with merciless speed. Every chant, every march, every defiant face in the crowd was captured and broadcast to millions in real time. Viral videos of demonstrators flooding Parliament Square were shared across continents within minutes. Hashtags like #StarmerOut, #Collapse of Labour and #Justice for Britain dominated global trends, amplifying the nation's fury into a deafening roar heard across the world. Memes mocked Starmer's silence, portraying him as a ghost haunting the halls of Downing Street, a coward trapped in his own house of lies. For ordinary Britons, this was no longer about scandal. It was about justice, about reclaiming a nation that had been stolen by corruption, secrecy and betrayal. Meanwhile, inside Westminster, the atmosphere turned poisonous. The Labour benches, once united, were splintering into open rebellion. Cabinet ministers resigned one after another, their carefully worded statements disguising raw desperation to escape the sinking ship. Each departure was another wound, another sign that the Prime Minister had already lost his authority. Backbench MPs whispered in corridors about triggering formal mechanisms to remove him, while party elders declared privately that Labour's survival now depended on immediate separation from its disgraced leader. The knives were no longer hidden, they were raised, and they were aimed directly at the man who had once been the party's saviour. The opposition wasted no time in sharpening the blade. Rishi Sunak thundered in Parliament that this was not merely the fall of one man, but proof that Labour itself was rotten beyond repair. Nigel Farage declared with triumph that the scandal marked the death of the old political order, positioning Reform UK as the only true alternative to restore honesty and sovereignty to Britain. Even smaller parties, long ignored in the battle for power, seized the moment, piling on their demands for resignation and elections. Never before had such a united chorus of condemnation been heard against a sitting Prime Minister, and the press, they feasted on the carcass of Labour's credibility. The Guardian's editorial pages, normally sympathetic, struck with unprecedented ferocity, declaring that Starmer's downfall was the greatest betrayal of modern democracy. The Daily Mail shouted of corruption at Number 10, while tabloids splashed his image across their covers with words like disgrace, collapse, and unfit. Broadcasters dissected every line of the Supreme Court ruling live on air, their commentary merciless and unrelenting. Talk shows tore into Starmer's silence, framing it as cowardice of the highest order. International outlets joined in, painting Britain as a democracy in collapse. The New York Times declared the judgment the most shocking political crisis since the war. French newspapers described Britain as adrift in uncharted waters, while Brussels processed ongoing negotiations, demanding stability before talks could continue. Even the White House, cautious in its words, warned Britain to uphold its democratic traditions or risk losing credibility on the world stage. Markets responded with brutal clarity. The pound plunged, stocks trembled, and investors pulled out, unwilling to trust a nation trapped in political paralysis. For businesses and allies abroad, the scandal was not just about Starmer, it was about Britain's very reliability as a nation. The longer the silence from number 10 dragged on, the deeper the damage became, and still Starmer refused to resign. Insiders described him pacing endlessly inside, raging at advisors, consumed by bitterness and denial. Every hour of his silence was another hour of betrayal in the eyes of the people. His refusal to step aside transformed him from embattled Prime Minister into a symbol of cowardice, a man hiding while his country burned. Britain was no longer simply experiencing a scandal, it was witnessing a reckoning. A collapse of leadership so profound that the very foundations of its democracy were being tested. And as the fury swelled in the streets, as resignations mounted in Parliament, as headlines screamed of chaos and collapse, one truth echoed across the nation: Keir Starmer's time was finished. The only question left was how long Britain could endure the silence before the inevitable end crashed down like a storm. The silence inside Downing Street was now deafening, a silence that hung over the nation like a curse. Hours had stretched into days, yet still Keir Starmer clung to office, barricaded behind the black doors of number 10, as though hiding from the inevitable storm outside. His refusal to speak only deepened the anger of the people, transforming fury into something dark: contempt. Britain had seen leaders fall before, but never like this. Never had a Prime Minister been condemned by the Supreme Court, rejected by the public, abandoned by allies, and yet still stubbornly clinging to the wreckage of power. The country felt leaderless, adrift, betrayed by a man who had once promised integrity, but who now embodied corruption, cowardice, and denial. Inside Parliament, Labour's implosion accelerated. Resignations that began as a trickle became a flood. Entire departments were left leaderless as ministers walked away, unwilling to defend the indefensible. Senior figures who had once fought to protect Starmer now sharpened their blades, appearing on television to declare that his refusal to resign threatened not just the party, but the survival of democracy itself. Letters of no confidence piled up on the desks of party whips, their numbers climbing by the hour. For Labour MPs, it was no longer a matter of loyalty or betrayal. It was survival. To remain with Starmer was to sink with him, and many had no intention of going down with a doomed ship. Within the party, whispers of an emergency leadership contest grew louder, with names like Angela Rayner and Wes Streeting circulating as potential saviours. Yet even this talk betrayed desperation. None could deny that Labour's brand was shattered, its credibility buried under the weight of the Supreme Court's judgment. In the eyes of the public, it no longer mattered who replaced Starmer. The damage was already done. The opposition tightened their grip, hammering the government with merciless precision. Conservatives demanded immediate elections, declaring that the people must choose who would lead them out of this nightmare. Nigel Farage relished the chaos, declaring Labour finished forever and positioning himself as the voice of ordinary Britons betrayed by the corrupt elite. The press amplified these attacks, turning every front page into a weapon. Headlines screamed of disgrace, collapse, betrayal. Televised debates replayed the judgment line by line, dissecting Starmer's failures in excruciating detail. Every image of him, gaunt, silent, haunted, became a symbol of political decay. International allies watched with growing alarm. Brussels, once eager to negotiate with Starmer's government, froze talks indefinitely, declaring that Britain could not be trusted until it had stable leadership. Washington warned of deep concerns about the erosion of democratic accountability. The pound continued to plummet, markets recoiled, and foreign investors fled, terrified of Britain's descent into chaos. What had begun as a scandal was now an international crisis, a spectacle of humiliation that made headlines across the world. And still, the people poured into the streets. Demonstrations swelled to historic proportions, with hundreds of thousands marching through London, their chants echoing like thunder. Resign! Resign! Parliament Square became a sea of banners, flames from torches lighting the night sky as if the nation itself were aflame. Police struggled to contain the rage, clashes broke out, and images of the unrest spread across social media, feeding the narrative of a nation on the edge of collapse. For many Britons, this was no longer simply about forcing Starmer to resign. It was about reclaiming their country, about purging a corrupt system that had betrayed them. Inside Downing Street, reports leaked of a Prime Minister unravelling. He raged at his advisers, lashing out at those who suggested he step down. He accused his enemies of betrayal, convinced himself that he was the victim of a conspiracy, even as his own party abandoned him. One aide described him as a man at war with reality, pacing through rooms like a prisoner unwilling to face the truth. His isolation grew unbearable, friends stopped calling, allies refused to visit, and even the civil service prepared for a transition of power. Number 10 became a fortress of denial, guarded not by strength but by fear, and yet the longer he stayed, the worse the crisis became. Britain was no longer governed. It was paralysed, policies were frozen, decisions delayed, international trust evaporated. Ordinary people paid the price as markets crashed. Inflation soared and uncertainty spread through every corner of society. The betrayal cut deeper each day, leaving scars that would last for generations. And through it all, the clock ticked relentlessly towards the inevitable. Starmer could not remain forever. The Supreme Court had spoken, the people had risen, the party had rebelled. His time was over. The only question left was whether he would be dragged out in disgrace or surrender what little dignity remained. Britain waited, breathless, for the final collapse. The end was no longer a question of if, but when. Britain held its breath as the crisis reached a boiling point, the fury of the people colliding with the stubbornness of a Prime Minister who refused to bow. Outside Number 10, the crowds had swelled into the tens of thousands, their chants shaking the air like thunder, their banners painting the night with words of rage. Traitor, coward, resign. Police lines buckled under the weight of the demonstrations, sirens wailed across Westminster, and clashes spilled into the streets as a restless nation demanded justice. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Advisers abandoned their posts, ministers refused his calls, and loyalists turned their backs. Keir Starmer was alone, trapped in the residence that had once symbolised power, but now felt like a prison. Every window of Downing Street seemed to echo the roar of the crowds outside. Every tick of the clock, another reminder that time had finally run out. His enemies, both within and without, smelled blood. Labour MPs openly called for his removal, some declaring that they would physically escort him out if he continued to resist. The opposition, united in rare harmony, demanded immediate elections, branding him a usurper clinging to power against the will of the people. Headlines screamed of collapse, with newspapers declaring Starmer's last stand and Britain held hostage. The media dissected his silence mercilessly, portraying him as a ghost haunting Number 10. Too weak to lead, yet too stubborn to surrender. International leaders piled on the pressure. Washington issued a rare public rebuke, warning that Britain's democratic image was being destroyed by Starmer's refusal to respect the judgment of the Supreme Court. Brussels declared that negotiations with Britain were suspended indefinitely, while allies across the Commonwealth expressed dismay at the chaos consuming the nation. The markets responded with brutal efficiency. The pound plunged further, stocks tumbled, and investment fled at an alarming rate. Britain, once respected as a pillar of stability, now looked like a nation on the edge of collapse, yet still Starmer resisted. Insiders revealed that he was consumed by paranoia, convinced that he was the victim of a coordinated coup, raging against the press, the courts, even his own party. He clung to the fantasy that if he just held on long enough, the storm would pass. But outside, the storm was not fading. It was growing. becoming a hurricane that no force could withstand. The pressure mounted with each passing hour. Protesters breached police lines, pushing closer to the gates of Downing Street. Social media exploded with calls for a people's march to physically force his removal. Rumours swirled of emergency meetings between senior Labour figures and the palace, whispers of constitutional mechanisms that could be triggered to end the standoff. Even the king, normally silent, was said to be deeply concerned about the paralysis gripping the nation. The atmosphere was electric, charged with the sense that history was about to be made. Britain had seen many political crises, but nothing of this scale. Nothing of this intensity. This was no ordinary fall from grace. It was a reckoning. The fall of Keir Starmer was not just the downfall of a leader, but the implosion of an entire political order built on broken promises and lies. And so the waiting continued, a nation caught in suspended animation, staring at the black door of number 10, waiting for it to open. Would Starmer emerge to face the people, to admit defeat, to step aside at last? Or would he cling to the end, forcing his own party, his own country, to drag him out in disgrace? The suspense was unbearable.